begin then. Um,
Sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new interview on doing sociology. And today we have with us Dr. Michiel Baas. He's a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. Thank you, Michael, for taking time out to do this with us today. To briefly introduce you about his work and about him, he holds his PhD in anthropology from the University of Amsterdam and has held various academic positions with the National University of Singapore, the Nalanda University, the International Institute for Asian Studies, and the University of Amsterdam. Most of his work centers on the Indian middle class, and he has published extensively on the topic of fitness and bodybuilding in India, Indian student migration to Australia, the migration trajectories of skilled professionals in Singapore, Indian migration industry, and the lives and lifestyles of IT professionals in Bangalore. And his most recent book is Muscular India, Masculinity, Mobility, and the New Middle Class, which was published in 2020. And we're going to talk a little more in detail about this book in this interview today. So thank you, Michael. Thank you for being with us today. To begin
Sure, it's
with,
my pleasure. It's really nice meeting you this way.
yeah. To begin with, my first question to you is: in your new book, you've talked about, the idea of confidently belonging to the middle class. Can you elaborate a little more on this?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is this idea of new middle class formation in India as a result of economic change and growth. This growth has always been fairly mercurial, and if you look through the history and the way sort of new middle class formations have been narrated, we see sort of the ups and downs in these developments as well. One of the sort of the central discussions about the Indian middle class for decades now has been the size of the middle class itself. And I kind of in my book use that as a way to interrogate what we actually mean when we call or label ourselves middle class. What happens when, when I interview an Indian informant and that informant tells me I belong to the middle class, or I'm new middle class, or I'm upper middle class. What does these categories mean? And I am, in a sense, less interested always in sort of highly specific category and definitions that are based on income or spending power or wealth, but instead far more interested in how do people derive at the conclusion that they belong somewhere within a hierarchy themselves. And so when I speak of confidently belonging, I'm talking about also this ingrained discussion about middle class belonging, which is in a sense about being, confident in your middle class belonging. And that speaks to the idea of people having belong to the middle class for a while already. So one of the kind of sort of divisions I work with is lower versus upper. So the upper middle class being the older middle class, usually a middle class with a history of belonging to the middle class, with which I mean, take for instance, South Delhi, the families there often label themselves as upper middle class. Now, why do they do it? It isn't necessarily because they are more well off than new middle class families that might hail from the periphery of NCR, but they do so on the basis that I've belonged to the middle class for a while already. So in a sense, what they can tell about themselves, what they narrate about themselves, and which is specifically what I am interested in as an anthropologist, is they tell a story of confidently belonging to the middle class. They're kind of the gatekeepers. They know who they are within the context of speaking about the middle class. And they can also confidently point at others saying, oh yeah, these are typically newcomers, or they don't know these things quite yet. And this brings me to sort of another aspect of middle class belonging. What I posit in the book is that it's mainly a tool to think with about hierarchies in social and cultural terms. So it doesn't make much sense to approach the idea of the middle class through economics of suggesting, well, you know, if you make X amount of money, you know, if you, let's say, have a family income of 50,000 rupees per month, then you are middle class. Or if you make a lakh per month, you might be belonging to the upper middle class. I'm just sketching something out. I think instead what is far more important is kind of sort of all these social cultural factors that people employ themselves to slot themselves in within a particular hierarchy.
Right. Apart from the middle class, you also address the question of masculinity in your book, and I would want to know, you know, how the ideas of the masculine, the body, and the middle class are connected, particularly in the Indian context. And, you know, since you talk about the fitness trainers, and I must say it's a very interesting book and a very interesting subject matter, because we don't see a lot of, you know, sociologists, anthropologists exploring it. So how do you see, you know, the fitness trainers using their bodies for upward social mobility?
Yeah. I think usually what helps here for those, especially who might be tuning into this recorded session at some point and haven't read the book yet, is that for me the starting point, you know, so that this research I've been involved in for roughly a decade or so, on and off, obviously, but it started really with a particular moment when I visited. Should start with the right point. When a friend of mine who worked for an IT company called Infosys once took me on a tour of the Infosys campus, this is roughly around 2003, he showed me a very well-equipped gym. And it was typically Infosys. So any person who's ever been to the Infosys campus outside Bangalore proper, really on the on Hosur Road, on East City, kind of will understand what I mean with the sense of alienation, what you feel when you step onto its premises. It's suddenly a very different world. It's like, you can best compare it to a very well-equipped 5-star resort with manicured lawns. It's quiet, spacious, lots of facilities that you wouldn't expect there to be, from boat rides to indeed a gym. And it kind of sort of, you know, he was just showing me around. He was a friend. And later I thought, why did I think of this as interesting or special? Why did it stay with me? And that had to do with the fact that I hadn't really come across any such gym anywhere else in India. They didn't really seem to exist. Malls were emerging around that time. I'd been coming to India for roughly 3-4 years already, and sort of mall culture was emerging, especially in Bangalore. So that stayed with me, but it never kind of, you know, I wasn't really looking into doing research on this topic. It was just something that susurrated in the background, like, this is interesting, like something's going on, but I couldn't quite put my finger what that was. That changed a couple of years later when the hit movie Om Shanti Om came out with Shah Rukh Khan in a lead role. And it was really, it was a stellar movie. I loved the movie. It was a, you know, it was a very joyful movie, and it was an incredible hit. I mean, the songs were popular. It was everywhere. It was iconic. But there was one scene in particular that was super iconic, and that was when Shah Rukh Khan took off his t-shirt or his shirt to reveal freshly baked abs. The papers couldn't stop talking about this bodily transformation that Shah Rukh Khan had gone through. And suddenly, not long after, I, revisiting India, often in Bangalore, where I have family myself, I could see these gyms emerge. So suddenly they were part of the urban landscape. And I had to recall this moment in 2003 when that wasn't the case at all. So all of this happened very quickly. And, you know, when I'm an urban anthropologist, so perhaps my eye is a bit more trained to it, but things can happen very quickly in India in terms of urban transformation. Suddenly these businesses will pop up. And, you know, more recently, all these places selling biological produce, for instance, that's one of these developments that suddenly emerged on the scene, and suddenly people are all into it. So I thought these things were interesting, and that's where the research kind of gradually started maturing in terms of a topic. And the question I started wondering about is that if we're suddenly seeing all these gyms, then who goes there and who works there? Because these are two aspects that characterize gyms the world over. You have the people who find employment in gyms and people who go there to transform their bodies, like I did this morning. I went to the gym, and you all do so with an agenda. You do so to lose weight, to become fitter, to build your body, with health, all that. But there is always a difference between client and trainer. And when I was invited to join Nalanda University, which was headquartered in Delhi, roughly, I think now 8 or 9 years ago, I forgot, getting old that way. They're now well established, of course, in Rajgir in Bihar, but at the time the headquarters was still just off Lodi Park. They said, what do you want to look into? And I said, actually, I want to look into this. More in particular, I want to better understand who works in these gyms. Because knowing the fee structure of these gyms, I could also understand that they were catering to a certain clientele that could afford gym services. So I also knew that a gym floor would be characterized by considerable difference in terms of earnings. Those who are able to afford a gym are not who work in the gym. And in that sense, it differs quite a bit from the West, where this difference in income is less extreme. So this was one question that I was kind of interested in, and what happens on the work floor, because I also knew that these bodies were highly coveted. Trainers have the bodies that the clients want. They want to achieve that for themselves. So these bodies, in a sense, also resonate with capital as, and in that sense, kind of sort of another aspect of the research gradually emerged. I started wondering what happens when clients seek the specific instructions, knowledge, input from employees that otherwise would not be part of their social world. So if you think of a fitness trainer, maybe at a starting position making 12K, and a client coming to the gym, with a salary of 120K, maybe an IT professional, you see what I'm pointing at. On the one hand, do you have the trainer who has the perfect body, the lean muscular body that is also popularized in Bollywood and in Hollywood and in Tollywood? It's everywhere. It's staring at you from billboards. It's being blown up, in terms of popularity. On the other hand, this is a guy who might be hailing from a new middle class background, who's new to kind of sort of this middle class environment, who has a very different story that has brought him to the gym than the client who, like I just spoke of, part of the research was situated in GK in Delhi, which is typically an upper middle class sort of elite area where people have a huge amount of disposable income to spend. So what happens if you put these things together in the small space and the highly kind of structured time that these groups come together, where, usually you just spend an hour in the gym, right? And after that you leave again. So I know I had to take a huge detour to come to your question. So, the different aspects that you want to know about masculinity, the body, I could go in different directions, but maybe at this junction, you have a follow-up question, Rituparna?
Yes, about the fitness trainers and how they use their bodies for upward social mobility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and I often call myself a slow anthropologist because I always work on multiple projects sort of parallel, and sometimes things need to mature quite a bit before I figure out why I'm interested in something. And so this was one of these moments that at some point Nalanda University said, okay, what are you interested in doing? I said, well, the question of social mobility, I'm from my PhD years a migration scholar. So a lot of the stuff I do has to do about mobility anyway. And already in my work, for instance, when I focused on Indian students who migrate to Australia for education and migration purposes, I knew that these stories were always also, characterized by social mobility, upward mobility. So I took that consideration into the gym floor. And as I just described, when you put clients and trainers together, there's a gap basically in social and cultural capital besides economic capital. One group, the trainers, belong to new middle class backgrounds. They don't usually have a history of belonging to the middle class. They are already quite upwardly mobile. And in preliminary interviews, what I noticed quite quickly is that for the trainers, being in the gym was also, in a sense, in an idea of working out. Because of the close proximity to their clients and the kind of intimate bonds that are being formed on the work floor, especially because the client needs to catch his breath quite frequently, which always is a good opportunity to chat. There is always a lot of sort of dialogue going on, a lot of chatting, a lot of information gathering. So already in the earliest interviews, I noticed that gym trainers often use that as an opportunity to learn from their clients. So on the gym floor, especially sort of in the higher end gyms, the conversation is usually in English, which is for the trainer, not a first language for the client. Often it is, because the client has often received all education primarily in English, plus a second language like Hindi or Kannada, whatever, depending on where it's grown up. Whereas the trainer usually comes from a vernacular upbringing and had to pick up English elsewhere. It's like in the first chapter, I described that in detail when I focus on Kishore, who comes from a weaver family who migrated from Oriya to Mumbai to work in the mills. That's what his dad did. And at some point he became upwardly mobile through working in the gym. And that's also how he fine-tuned his English. And when I met him for the first time more than a decade ago, his English was quite rudimentary. I mean, he could make himself be understood perfectly well, but it wasn't the kind of English that he could use for marketing purposes to sell his gym services, or he needed a lot of help. Over the years, because of his exposure to his clients, he would use that as an opportunity to learn, not just about speaking English, but also about all sorts of other things, of what it actually meant to, like we come back to that idea of confidently belonging to the middle classes. Also in terms of comportment, a certain way of dressing, and all these things that you can't really define that specifically, but that kind of is a dead giveaway when you live in India long enough and you are asked to slot in a person within a certain hierarchy. You know, how you pick up on that and you kind of realize, oh, that person comes from X kind of a family, religion or caste, all these kind of things that you can think of as mapping, like you pick up on it, like clues. And for him, being from a typical labor class family in Chembur in Mumbai, coming from a weaver family with a father who can barely read or write, being uneducated himself, having only sort of, I think, gone to school till 12th standard, or maybe not even that, I don't recall, maybe 10th standard. Of course, Marathi medium, with some Hindi knowledge, and speaking Oriyan at home. English really comes as the third language in that spectrum, and never as reading or writing. And certainly not the kind of school you guys might have gone through yourself when you went to English medium, and all of that came as, you know, one of your first languages. So it's all these moments within the gym that offer an opportunity of kind of social mobility as well as cultural mobility. And the way I employ both concepts is social mobility, I mainly think of as kind of sort of moving up the ladder. Whereas cultural mobility kind of speaks more to, I deviate a little bit from Bourdieu here, because I don't find that theoretical frame works that well in India. It's typically based a very sort of Western kind of way of thinking about mobility, very French way. Whereas in India, this cultural mobility, I think, speaks more to the idea of doing things differently, kind of having the space to do something else in life, to deviate from the kind of path that has been set out for you before. When you look at that from the sort of an upper middle class typical thing, if I go back to my work among IT professionals, that had a lot to do with, my father was an engineer, so I became an IT professional, or, you know, that's sort of within that same frame of working. Within Kishore's story, it would have meant that he would have done some profession that, like his dad, would have made him an X amount of money, and but typically sort of a labor profession. But he's decided to do something very different, and this kind of mobility comes with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of insecurity, and a lot of doubt from family members who have no idea how to relate with that. So these kind of the concepts that frame that bigger exploration.
Right, right. Very interesting. So, Dr. Baas, we also have a section called "What is Ethnography" in our blog. And since yours is a very ethnographic, primary research-based work, I wanted to know about the challenges and the, uniqueness of your field experiences as an anthropologist, studying masculinity in the gyms in India.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways, a lot of directions I can go with this topic. So you'll just have to interrupt me if it gets boring, or you think like I've deviated too far from where you think I should be headed. Like I said before, I think of myself basically as a slow anthropologist, not as a slow-witted one, but more one who takes a lot of time to figure things out. Often because when I become interested in something, I often don't have a very good question why. It's just something that needs to mature over time. And with this kind of sort of the ethnographic approach I took with this, and for those of you who've read the whole book know that I cover 4 different cities. So part of the research was situated in Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, and Mumbai. But then I also make some side steps into Pune and into Rajgir even, which, not Rajgir, Patna, which I don't write about in the book, but I do so in related publications. One of the things that I think as an anthropologist, and I am obviously a white male European cisgendered person, these are all things that I keep in mind when I'm in my field, when I interact with informants. It colors the way I gather data. I'm also, in this case, not a very athletic person. So I could definitely not argue to my informants that I came to this research topic from a personal interest in building muscles. My personal interest has always been to keep my weight at bay. If anything, I'm not a very sporty person. So one of the things you'll find the moment you start doing a research like this one, where generally people, you navigate among people who have a very strong and specific interest in the body, is that immediately people will want to understand why you're interested in this topic. And nobody ever kind of sort of trains you into dealing with that question, because it also comes with a huge gap, usually in terms of knowledge. One of the things I found interviewing and interacting with bodybuilders, and to a lesser extent with fitness trainers, was that their world is very different in its orientation from mine. As an anthropologist and highly educated and with a PhD, I can explain to my fellow colleagues like you guys, why I'm working on a certain topic, and it will make perfect sense to you. But when I start doing that on the gym floor, none of that makes much sense. For one, most of the guys I interviewed, especially the trainers who come from lower middle class families with limited education, have no way of understanding or relating. Relating is the better word, not understanding, but relating to why it might be that a university would actually pay me to do this research, to ask really clumsy questions, to be in a faraway country, to choose to live in Delhi for a long period of time to look into a particular topic. I, at the same time, always think like that has also made it sometimes possible for me as an outsider to ask very different questions than my Indian colleagues, who sometimes struggle to get to the bottom of certain topics, not because they know too little, but because they know too much, or because the immediate setup is one where, you know, doors close because of the expectations people already have vis-a-vis each other. So one of the advantages I sometimes have is that I can be the kind of sort of the dumb firang in the room who doesn't quite know, but because of that picks up on other stuff. So that's one aspect of me doing ethnographic work, and I tend to use that also to my advantage when I write a book. I don't know if you want me to speak more about how I wrote my book or how I conducted my research in broader terms, or
Yeah, maybe, you know, something about also writing and research, the relationship.
Yeah, there was one with this book in particular. This book was written at some point. I was stationed in Chennai to look into a very different topic. You mentioned it briefly in my introduction. I wrote some things on the migration industry as it exists in the greater Chennai region. That research was really all about me figuring out why it is that when Indian migrants to Singapore, they often cite very high amounts that they have paid to migration agents to migrate to Singapore. And I was there to figure out basically why that is and how that works. And I was with a research institute in Bangalore at the time, but a lot of the work was actually done in Chennai. And I remember walking from appointment to appointment at some point at a flyover in the burning sun, as dumb white people do, thinking that it was shorter to walk and less of a hassle than negotiate with an overactive auto driver. And I was walking on that flyover, and I've been coming to Chennai for 2 decades ago. It always surprises me that there is still one more flyover left to build. And I kind of looked at sort of this urban jungle that unfolded from the flyover, and the kind of sort of things, the different sort of moving in different kind of people in different economic circumstances, the blinking light of a shopping mall in the distance. And I realized I had arrived at a position where these differences had started making so much sense to me that I suddenly felt that urge to write about that, not so much write about my migration research, but write about this, you know, the way I myself have experienced urban change in India in the past 2 decades, and all these thoughts associated with it, and how these thoughts then connect to sometimes very small observations, like I sketched earlier on Infosys campus, seeing suddenly a very well-equipped gym, or me watching Om Shanti Om, and later, you know, a year later, watching Amir Khan play in Gajni, the Hindi remake of the Tamil movie, which is again a remake of an American movie, and kind of seeing young guys, especially in the South, suddenly have this sort of cut in their hair, sort of mimicking Amir Khan, and this idea of transformation. And I don't know if it was I was about to get a sunstroke because I was walking in the burning sun, but it was also that hit, you know, suddenly you can feel a light, and you think like, oh my God, all these things are coming together. You know, all of this is about transformation, this whole idea of, you know, urban transformation, and how haphazardly it sometimes happens and how fast it sometimes happens. But then I was also recalling the interviews I'd done with all these trainers and bodybuilders, realizing that, well, they had transformed that body. They also had always sort of insisted that it had taken them a lot of time to do so. And that they felt that it had taken them even longer to transform their own lives and that of their families. So there was this kind of sort of narrations or discourses on speed. And meanwhile, I was observing traffic and traffic coming to a standstill and getting clocked. And it reminded me also of arteries and of upper middle class people making their way into the gym. And in particular, the gym that I did fieldwork in Delhi, where most of the clients like me were overweight to a certain degree, struggling with obesity, with weight gain, with sedentary lifestyles, with sitting on their asses like I was doing all the time, with air pollution, with not walking, with asthmatic problems, with, you know, clogged arteries and lungs. And so it was all on that flyover that suddenly that hit me like, you know, like, oh, this is the story that I need to be writing. And I remember, you know, I still did the appointment that I was heading for. I did the interview, which was with a migration agent. And then I just headed home, and I was staying with a friend who lived in this kind of sort of area towards the airport, which was kind of sort of a half-baked gated community, not quite gated enough to be really the way you would think of a gated community. There was always some stray dog walking around. There was always some grass you shouldn't step in. The backyard door you shouldn't open too quickly because there might be a cobra on top of the washing machine. But it was kind of heading back home and still thinking of that moment on the flyover, that the narrative, the kind of structure of the books emerged itself to me, the different aspects that I wanted to talk about, all in relation to ideas of transformation. And I think it's probably also the idea of the title came to me, the idea of Muscular India, of India developing, of India taking its place on the global stage as an increasingly powerful economic nation, of a nation which is a center for information technology and all these things, and but also a nation that is struggling with 1.3 billion people who are all trying to get ahead, or all trying to be successful in their own way, who are competing with themselves. And then, you know, in a much smaller way, because this is me as an ethnographer, I always work with very small data sets, obviously, with very small numbers of people that I've gotten to know intimately over a very long period of time, like Kishore in the first chapter. I've known for about a decade, and realizing that the stories he's been telling me about this life also run parallel to sort of bigger developments within India in terms of social and economic change. So I got home, I rushed to my laptop, and I wrote a first draft of what I want to talk about. And I can confidently say that none of that in the end became the book, because then I started writing it, and then the story kind of took me by its hand, and I kind of let it take me to the places it needed to go to. And then, of course, it needed to be rewritten quite a few times. And if I may say one final thing before you probably think I'm droning on way too long, but is the book at the same time is written very, very clearly in mind with an Indian audience, so not with an international audience. So I wanted this book to make sense in India, for my peers, my informants, my family, my friends in India to read this book and agree with me in a sense. So this wasn't typically a book that was written with an international academic press in mind. I'm getting a little weary with these presses as well. They're often very expensive, so people can't buy a book. Like my first book initially was like ridiculously expensive. It later came out in an Indian edition. This is a book that came out 10 years ago, but I've always regretted doing it in that way. So in this book was very much written in mind, like I want this to come out with an Indian press. I want it to be a book that you can buy for roughly 500 rupees instead of 5,000 rupees. And I wanted to be a book that people can have a dialogue with. So I want there to be reviews in Indian newspapers where, you know, serious journalists analyze this book and tell me if I'm right or wrong. That was part of the objective as well. I wanted this to be kind of a bigger dialogue, instead of this being a book with, I don't know, with Duke University Press, which probably would have resulted in a far more theoretical book where I would have endlessly had to engage with Bourdieu and with Foucault and Baudrillard and all these people. Instead, I thought, no, I really wanted to have kind of sort of a book that spoke also to previous publications that I had really learned a lot from, like, for instance, Akash Kapoor's book, which came out more than a decade ago, titled India Becoming, but also scholars like Lila Fernandez, and who wrote this book, very influential book on the Indian middle class, and quite a few others. Also, you know, both academic and scholarly, so kind of sort of publicly accessible. So that's in the end what this ethnography became. Over to you.
Right. Thank you so much, because, you know, you have shared so much from your own experiences of doing ethnography, and also about writing, you know, how you went about with writing the text. So, and because, you know, our viewers, a lot of them are very early stage scholars, researchers. I think they'll take a lot from your experiences. And I think the point about, you know, having you know, this book which everybody in India could read, you know, which is accessible and affordable, I think we can very much relate to it, because as researchers, we are often caught up in this dilemma, because you really want to read this book, but then it costs so much, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Now then, you know, finally moving to the final question that we have for you in this interview is, your book now, you know, how does it contribute to the larger domain of masculinity studies and sexuality studies? If you could throw some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm very passionate about this, so I might go on too long again. So one of the things that has, you know, throughout my various stays in India, of course, I've seen the discussion on gender and masculinity develop, but also become harsher, especially post the atrocities committed during the, you know, the Delhi gang rape, which was 2013. Yeah.
12.
Oh yeah, yeah, and obviously, you know, the discussion both in you know, in popular media as well as in academics hardened. And justifiably, there was a lot going on. It was absolutely horrific. And of course, it was the one that took the limelight, but there were so many such cases. And the moment one starts looking into NGO data, academic data, this gruesome picture emerges. And of course, my friends also had complained about that. My female friends in India about, you know, being bothered and harassed and Eve teasing and all these things. So at the same time, one of the things I struggled a little bit with was that the men I would meet in the gym and elsewhere would also often be very worried about this and very critical of the way things were developing in India. And I tried to understand, I gain a better understanding for myself as to where might certain behavior come from and why am I not observing it? And one of the questions I often get during kind of sort of public fora is, oh, these muscular men must be overtly masculine types, and they might be actually the types who bother women, for instance, in the street or show a certain behavior. And I guess there's a reason for that. There have been some documentaries, for instance, this suggestion in Anand Padwaran's documentary from a long back, it's more than 20 years old now, where this suggestion is made, where it's connected to ideas of Hindutva, for instance. People have written about this extensively, and I didn't encounter that in the gym. And I thought, this is interesting. Why am I not encountering it? And what goes wrong in our discussion or in our understanding of what is taking place in the public streets? And then I had this incredibly interesting conversation of quite a few years ago with this colleague of mine at Nalanda University, himself of a Bihari background. And he described a scene where he was in a public bus with his girlfriend. They were coming back from campus. They were both with DU. They were going home. And a couple of guys boarded the bus, and they were, as he would describe them, probably kind of sort of internal migrants of Bihari background, so he could understand what they were saying. And they were kind of sort of teasing the conductor. They were, unwilling to pay for their bus tickets. They were annoying people on the bus, and they very quickly got off the bus. And my friend and colleague described it as it was very uncomfortable for all of us, but he said, because I, as a Bihari, could actually understand what they were saying, I also realized that basically, as he described it, he said, you need to think of, he said, I always tell myself, he himself is typically from a family of administrators, trained in English, parents both highly educated. He said, that bus to me was also, I could see how that bus is the only place where these guys can matter. And I thought that was quite a harsh judgment, but he actually didn't mean it as such. He said, that bus, he said, for these guys, the city is very inaccessible. The public space is where they can be men. That's what they've trained to think of them. But malls are too expensive for them. The guard might not actually let them in. None of the things they can afford inside. All these new developments, all these new spaces that tell the story of a new India are actually not for them at all. So their behavior, their rowdy behavior, also needs to be understood as a way of making themselves be felt in public space. And we had a long conversation about the different dynamics. And of course, my friend is also a sociologist, so, it made sense. And I thought it was such a crucial exploration to think with what happens in public space when men behave in the way they do, and why, for instance, I wouldn't find this among fitness trainers who are upwardly mobile. And part of this, of course, has to do with that they don't need to. They are already being noticed. The moment they step outside the gym, people stare at them in admiration. I've been in so many such situations where we would meet for coffee somewhere and the place would literally fall silent because everybody would be checking out my informant, gossiping about my informant, pointing at them. But they're also in a position where they're able to make something of their lives. They are working hard. They're benefiting from close proximity of people from whom they can learn. This is often something they themselves use to explain why it is beneficial for them to work at a gym, because also for the families they come from, the income they make, especially at the beginning, is quite minimal. I mean, for a new middle-class family, a land-owning family, maybe from a Gujar background in the periphery area, in the, the NCR area, 15,000 rupees is nothing. That doesn't buy you anything in Delhi, certainly not how they imagine themselves to look with branded clothing that comes from the mall. So why might it be interesting for them to be in the gym? And part of it is indeed the social and cultural capital accumulation, this space of being in this proximity where you can work on yourself, where you can work yourself up. And obviously the guys my colleague encountered in the bus were in no such position. And so when it comes to masculinity, I often point at that we need to better understand also how the socioeconomics govern hierarchies in public space, why men might be doing what they do, and that we need to be careful of kind of pointing the finger at the Indian male as the problem, as is often done in popular media. And I know that because it's a shorthand, it's easy to talk with and to point at men being the problem. But then a lot of the men I met over time weren't necessarily the problem. They were as worried as everybody else for their sisters, their wives, their girlfriends, their colleagues, their female colleagues. My fitness trainer informants were collaborating with women every day on the gym floor as colleagues. They were assisting female clients. A lot of gyms actually have courses to train their trainers to deal with gender difference. They would be the guys who who themselves provide women with training for self-defense courses. So in that sense, it made me slightly hopeful. But I don't want to romanticize any of that either. Obviously, I got to see a glimpse of it. And the objective within my research was not to fully penetrate all the dimensions of this, but I think it helped me come to terms a little bit with the predicament that we all feel when we look into this as anthropologists, that this incredible harassment, this unsafety that women meet in Indian streets is not one that unites all Indian men, but that certain Indian men do engage in, and we need to better understand why that is. And probably in that inquiry, we probably need to deviate a little bit from pointing at all sorts of sort of characteristics that come to mind first, like the way these men have been raised in families where the mother was always working, blah, blah, blah. So I can't say I have all the answers there, but I hope my work at least contributes a little bit to that discussion, and maybe propels also people to do more ethnographic work among men, because we're still seeing relatively little of that. There is really quite a bit on Indian women these days. But of course, if we want to understand men, we need to ask them very critical questions. We need to better understand, and I firmly believe that ethnography, simply spending time with people, understanding their life worlds better, especially in the context of change, which my book is all about, this idea of the new India, of change, of, what is going on. It can help penetrate that complexity. I don't know how you feel about that yourself. Perhaps it's something you're working on yourself. And yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Baas, for the very interesting conversation and the insights. On behalf of Doing Sociology, we would actually like to thank you for taking time out to do this. For our viewers, we have also done an interview with Professor Sanjay Srivastava, where he talks about the middle class and masculinity a little bit. So maybe you can connect it with this one. And also, I hope that more of you read his new book, which is very, very interesting and fabulous, as he has run us through it. So thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
I'm very glad to say that Sanjay Srivastava read kind of sort of an earlier draft, and I was one of the incredible things when he sent me his endorsement of my book. This is not for promotional purposes, but I still feel a little bit like a fanboy, because I think his work is absolutely brilliant, and I think any junior but also senior scholar, there's such a wealth of ideas to excavate, uncover there and learn from. So yeah, do read Sanjay Srivastava's book, and I think the most recent one on Noida, which is Entangled Urbanisms, is absolutely brilliant. So yeah.
Absolutely, read both the books. Yeah, thank you.